My name is Maureen Aylward, and this is our second anniversary show tonight. 2 years ago, we started Fish Tales with just a hope and a prayer kind of a thing. We didn't know who would show up, and then we had 50 people in the Writer Center, and it was a great showing that night, and we've just plugged away and plugged away. And thank you to all of the storytellers who've come out for the last couple of years. Many of them are here tonight. We have a lot of new people telling stories this evening, and I've got a great lineup for you. I'm sure that you'll be riveted, the edge of your seat. Maybe you might even cry. Who knows? We've had some of that. We've had wonderful stories of the past couple of years, from the heart, from the soul, and just from a lot of fun. And tonight's theme is Heroines and Heroes. And again, we've got a great lineup. So let's get started. Our storyteller in residence, Ms. Virginia McKinnon, has been with us for these 2 years. She's come to almost every single Fish Tales, and it's a real pleasure to have you here tonight, Virginia.
Do you want to use the podium?
Yeah, that
Do you
would
want
be
to use
nice.
the podium?
A little easier. Put down there. Okay. I have a story tonight about my hero. And they say a picture's worth 1,000 years, so I brought his picture in for all to see. That's him. That's my hero. That's my husband. Yeah, Robert Hillary McKinnon. Yeah. You can see why I fell in love with him. Yeah. So he was actually born in 8 Washington Square. We actually lived in the same neighborhood because I was born at 14 Gould Court. And Bob used to play sports with the Gould Court gang. Being 5 years older than me, we really never knew each other. And Bob states he began bodybuilding as the Italian kids from down the fort, they were always bullying him. So he learned to be a fast runner. In fact, in high school, as a freshman, he raced and he beat the fastest runner in the state. And Nate Ross had him play football on the senior team in his freshman year. He never entered any bodybuilding contests, but I believe he would have won first prize. So at age 17, Bob quit school and he joined the Navy. Soon he was shipped off to the Asiatic Pacific, and he was stationed as a machinist mate, maintaining the engines on the LCTs and the LSTs, so landing troops and supplies. In 2004, a well-kept secret was revealed after 60 years. It was in 1944, there was a marine disaster at West Loch, Hawaii. The U.S. Navy was preparing to invade Saipan. When Bob's ship and 7 other ships exploded, he witnessed the explosion, but no one ever believed him. It was kept such a secret because they were getting ready for this invasion, but it only delayed the invasion for 2 months. When he mentioned this event, no one believed him. Many of his shipmates were killed or injured, and all his belongings were lost. So Bob was asked to fill out a requisition form. So he listed his Blue Book manual for $1, a razor kit for $5, and a toilet kit for $5, a total of $11. He was never reimbursed, but he retained a copy of this invoice that stated Marine Disaster at West Loch. Bob also took part in the invasion of the island of Tarawa, and he was jumping around the Philippines, the Marianas, and the Gilbert Islands. He never believed he would return home from World War II. Well, it was in April of 1953. I was working at Johnson's insurance office. That's now where the new Pinoli's restaurant is. And Bob was working at the independent machine shop. Actually, the machine shop was in this area around Harbor Loop, and the Urban Renewal took it. They took that whole part of the city away. He was repairing the engines on the fishing boats. Bob was walking up Duncan Street for his mug-up at Sterling's, and looking in the window of the insurance office, he said it was love at first sight. And a few weeks later, he was repairing the engine on the fishing boat American Eagle, and his friend, my Uncle Peter, was the engineer. And Bob asked to be introduced to me. Well, after a short courtship, we were married on Thanksgiving Day in 1953. Bob's faced many adversities in his life, never giving up. He has always continued to lift weights. In 1988, Bob had a major stroke, paralyzing his right side. He was unable to walk or use his right hand. After many weeks of rehabilitation, he was able to regain his ability to walk, to drive, and to return to a normal life. And then in 1997, Bob was diagnosed to have an inoperable aortic aneurysm. His doctor advised him to just take care of his affairs, not to lift more than 20 pounds, as he would not live more than 3 months. So we bought the cemetery lot and the gravestone, and all the arrangements were made for his departure. Well, with great determination, Bob stated, "I'm going to live my last days as a happy man." And he continued to lift 220 pounds. And in 2003, Bob had a home accident. This was really, I thought he was taking a nap, and all the time he was down in the basement lighting the pellet stove. And when he didn't see the spark, he picked up a bottle of denatured alcohol, a dish detergent bottle, and squirted on and it backfired. The bottle exploded in his hand. He was a human torch. And I heard this little knock on the door saying, "Help me." I opened the door. There he was standing there naked with skin hanging off, and he's got third-degree burns on 20% of his body. And he went to Brigham and Women's Hospital. After the surgery for skin grafts, he became hysterical as he was back on his burning ship in World War II. They had 4 psychiatrists come in to evaluate him. They said this was the worst case of PTSD that they had seen from repressed memories from World War II. The doctors said he would never use his right hand again. It would just burn to the bone, and so was his arm. He spent 6 weeks at Shaughnessy Rehab, and many months we kept returning to Boston to have the skin deburred. Well, he never gave up, and he got full use of his right hand again. And then in 2008, he was climbing a ledge in the backyard with a pickaxe in his hand, and he was chopping the tree roots to divert the flow of water from the mountain in back of our house away from the house. Well, he fell backwards, and he fractured his right hip. In October 2012, he suffered his 5th stroke. That was 3 more weeks in New England rehab. He now uses a walker. He continues to be independent. In fact, he made my breakfast this morning. And yes, I call him Popeye my Sailor Man. I am what I am, and no one's going to change him. At 90 years old, he continues to lift weights in the home gym. He loves yard sales because he can fix anything, working as a diesel machinist. A loving family at his side. He's a proud dad of 7 children, 8 grandchildren, and 7 great-grandchildren. And this year we will be celebrating our 62nd wedding anniversary, living independently in our own home, truly blessed and still in love.
Virginia, you never cease to amaze us. Everything, every single story is fantastic. Our next storyteller is someone that I like to call the Sultan of Snark, Jim Dowd from the Gloucester Clan.
All right, see how that works? All right.
How's everyone doing? Good. This is funny because the story I'm going to tell is one that actually a lot of people in the room I'm looking around actually were there when it happened. And it happened in 2007. A lot of folks who aren't from Gloucester will remember that the temple burned down up on Middle Street. And it was you think tonight is cold. That was the coldest night any of us can remember. It was insanely cold. And the apartment building next to the temple caught fire. And the way that building was constructed, according to the firemen that I know, said it was like a pizza oven. It was ceramic on the outside basically, and it was wood on the inside. And the whole thing just acted as a huge chimney. It burned, and a friend of mine's a cop, and he said you should have seen the fire bombs just landing around town everywhere. Just these pieces of burning stuff just falling all over the place. And if it hadn't snowed as hard as it had snowed, those fire bombs would have caught all the roofs on Middle Street on fire. But fortunately, it had snowed the night before. But the temple was too close, and it burned down. And actually, a life was lost in that apartment building. They got as many people out as they could, but they could not. The firefighters could not get this one guy out, and they were in the room. They were up on a ladder, and they were trying to get him out. And they said they just heard the popping, pop, 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 and they know that the building was about to go up. And they got out of there, and you could just, I mean, the video is horrifying. And then just like basically just flame comes out, and they couldn't do anything. And so they went over to the temple, and they did what they could there, and it wasn't a lot. And so the next morning we got up, and the phone was ringing, and it was I think it was Amy Farber, which is funny because I know Amy, she's a member of the temple, but I usually think of her as like the person who works in the shoe store. I'm like, why is someone calling me from the shoe store? This doesn't make any sense. This early in the morning, and so the temple had burned. So we go there, and it was difficult. I kind of married into this religion. I was not the one that I grew up with, but it has been the one that has been sort of my spiritual home now for 20 years. And to have a place that sort of where you've been to funerals and your kids, naming ceremonies and where that stuff has happened, have it just gone was hard for me. But what I didn't realize was that for the community, it was even harder because the Torah that had been there, the scrolls that had been there, one of them had come from the Ukraine, and it had escaped a previous fire, shall we say, before the Second World War, and only to come to Gloucester and be used for many years to not survive. And so that was particularly difficult. And so we're standing there looking at this literally smoking hole with still on fire, and my wife is both crying, and we have our kids, and it was difficult. And Lou Goldish, I remember, folks who know Lou, he's a pretty amazing guy. And he's co-president of the temple at the time, and he walks up to us, and he puts his hand on my wife's shoulder, and he says, her name's Sharon. He says, Sharon, don't worry, Jews are good at two things, overcoming tragedy and having a lot of insurance. So it was assumed while the thing was still on fire that we would rebuild. So we shuffle up to the UU, to the Universalist Unitarian. And you always have to say Universalist Unitarian. They don't let you just say Unitarian because it's like one of those people like, my name is Murray Anthony. You had to say the whole name, So we went up to the UU and we opened, and it's freezing in there. I mean, it was cold in there. Folks who know that building is another gorgeous building. It was cold as crap in there. We're sitting there like literally, I'm in a down coat. I got kids, and they just were freezing in there. And everyone from the temple is there, and people are there, and people are coming, and the governor was, all kinds of people are there, and we're saying the Kaddish for the prayer for the dead for the man who lost his life in the building next door, and it was sad. It was a very sad. I mean, again, folks were there. It was a very, very sad moment. And then all of a sudden, the doors. I'm sitting in the kind of back of the UNU, and the doors open up, and these streams of light literally come pouring into that freezing cold building. And I turn to go like, shut the freaking door, and the firefighters come in. And these guys are in their turnout coats. There's ice hanging off of these guys. They got radios on, oxygen equipment. They're like in their stuff. You can smell them. They came in, and you could smell these guys. It smelled like smoke. And they've got boxes. They got boxes. And everyone's like, did they get the Torahs? Were they able to get the Torahs? Were they able to get them? And we're looking, and they've got, everyone's looking, did they get the Torahs? They get the Torahs? And looking, and they got a box of yarmulkes. Those are just hats, just so everyone knows. Like, that's it's not like, we lost our yarmulkes, right? It's like, it's like, it's not a huge deal. You got to wear them, but and then they got some talent. They got some prayer shawls. Good. They got some books. And what's funny is so books a Torah is a book, right? It's a book, and it's an important thing. After this, like in the spring after the fire, we literally had. This is how important books are in general, but to Jews, we actually had to go have a funeral for those books. If those books hadn't burned, we just could have, but we had to actually go at the Jewish cemetery in Gloucester, up in West Gloucester, there is a grave that we went and buried books, because you can't just throw them away. We had a thing, the whole deal, right? So, sorry? China as well. You got a set, and you got another set, and your grandmother gives you a set. Thanks, it's my wife, people, yes. I feel like I've taken it on. I wasn't born into it, but I feel like I'm getting it, right? It's finally, So did they get it? They didn't get it. They had some books that were wet, and they had the shawls, and I'm like, they didn't get the Torahs, and I'm like, they probably didn't know what Torahs were. What do we grab? Get the hats! It's what you got to figure these guys were thinking, right? I see them with the hats sometimes. Get the hats, right? And so, like, you idiots, right? And what was interesting at that moment was I'm kind of pissed at these guys, and a weird thing happened. So if anyone who's ever been to a Jewish ceremony, one of the most important parts of the ceremony is they take out the Torahs out of the ark and they walk around with the Torahs, with the scrolls. It's like, word of God, people, right? And people take their talit, their prayer shawls, and they kiss the talit and they touch the Torah covering or the person holding it. And that's kind of books are important, right? Throw the book at them, buy the book. Like, books are important. But the books are gone. And so what was weird was, just as these guys were coming down reflexively, someone kisses their talit and touches a firefighter. And someone else does it. And people start reaching out their hands to touch these firefighters as they come down this streak of light. And again, people in the room then they just came up to the front and they laid the stuff that they were able to get on the front of the altar of the UU and just stood there, and they couldn't get the guy out. They couldn't get the guy out, and they just got what they could.
Thank you, Jim. Our next storyteller is someone I like to call a regular. Cindy Szymanski, come on up.
Hello. This is dedicated to those who help me want to stay. My heroines and heroes aren't the ones you see in the news. They are the ones behind the scenes, the ones who help raise me, save me, and shape me into who I am. These are the ones who are shining stars in my heart. My mother, who did a superior job raising my brother and I after our father was murdered the day before her 29th birthday. Mom's recovery from the bereavement and her subsequent tenacity taught by example the exemplary person one can be in the face of extreme adversity. One can be brave, strong, and compassionate to others, no matter how bad your life might be. Miss Tigger, my kindergarten teacher, who upon noticing my Father's Day distress, was keen enough to suggest I make a card for my brother, an alternative tradition I still carry on 46 years later. The school nurse, who let me stay on her office couch, many times pacifying my 6-year-old psychosomatic symptoms of loss, confusion, and grief. Fran, the sympathetic crossing guard, who noticed the needs of a 7-year-old latchkey kid and read stories to me after school. My grandfather, who took my brother under his wing and had him working as a helper installing fence at 9 years old, who was a more than suitable male figure to a fatherless boy, setting a good work ethic and keeping him out of trouble. My grandmother, who was a constant companion, friend, and role model of strength, who survived a depression, 2 muggings, and a burglary, and as a 70-year-old widow, carried a concealed box cutter to her car after work to protect herself. A woman whose independence in a non-idyllic world I inherited, along with the idiosyncrasy of hoarding collectibles. My brother Fritz, who protected me, by standing guard at the gate of the horror house we called home, to prevent me from walking into the nightmare that was our stepfather, who had a demented alcoholic's agenda as well as an arsenal. Big brother, who later duked it out with disrespectful guys and bonehead boyfriends. Who gave me my first car, a 1964 Plymouth Valiant, victoriously representative of the independence and freedom that I needed. Our neighbors, Eddie and Betty Townsley, who unofficially adopted me into their family, who helped me escape from the secret hell I lived at home by welcoming me into the house for sleepovers and on excursions to lakes and to the shore. My sisters from my adopted family, Barbara, Sue, Patty, and Mary, for sharing their mom and pop with me and loving me like a sister, and later in life presenting me as Aunt Cindy to their children. Lady, my German Shepherd Husky, who placed her head on my lap, looked up at me, and calmed me with her soulful eyes when she found me sobbing after I was ordered by stepdad to take the peace sign down from my wall because there was no peace in the world. Miss Gore, my 6th grade teacher, who encouraged reading and brought in a collection of books for the class to borrow. I became an avid reader as I escaped into those fictional stories and took flight away from the stark reality of my life. Mr. Pardine, my high school math teacher, who spent self-inflicted detention hours staying after school with me, an attendance deficit sophomore student who's having difficulty at home and with catching up on geometry. My second stepfather, Chuck, who proves it isn't who planted the seed that makes a guy a true dad, who has had our best interest at heart for 36 years as a father and a friend, who completed our once fledgling family and made our nest whole. Dr. Deborah Bradley, who saved my life by defying the insurance companies and sending me for a mammogram earlier than the age stipulated in the insurance regulations. Pat O'Malley, my best bud, who rushed right over when I received a dreadful diagnosis, who has taken me to the hospital, then stayed with me when released and answered to a bell to help me out of bed, who has been through many years and tribulations in my personal soap opera as Cindy's World Turns. Never judgmental, she blamed it all on the aliens fucking with my head to take the guilt away from my lack of sense. Puppy, my Dalmatian black Labrador retriever, who slowly climbed into my bed, one paw at a time so as not to disturb me after surgery, then placed her head on the pillow next to mine and sighed as if to say, "I'm here for you." Mamadou, an African drum master and friend, who advised me that until I loved myself, I would not be able to accept anyone in my heart. Such profound prophecy, because finally, but not lastly, my husband Frank, who waited patiently for me to find a peaceful path towards him, proposed, and I became Cinderella to his Prince Charming, and we lived happily ever after in our house on the hill. So for loving, supportive, and positive influences in my life, I thank you all for making my stay in this world more pleasant, more comfortable, livable. I have wanted to stay because of you.
Thanks, Cindy. Next up is one of our special guests, Kevin Baker from New York City. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We're really excited to hear your story.
Thanks so much for having me, and Tom, thanks for the room there. It is actually nicer than the room I grew up in the Cove, and twice the size of my New York City apartment. So there you go. A few summers ago, I found myself spending a lot of time in Salem. I'd go walk out at night and watch the professional old crones with their lanterns leading the tourists around all the witchy sights. I'd walk down that little pedestrian mall they have past the statue of Elizabeth Montgomery and Bewitched, and stare into the shops selling all your goth and new age needs, along with all those knickknacks, all those witch lighters and witch keychains and witch pencils with witch erasers and witch hats and witch hoodies, right down to my very favorite item, which is a bumper sticker that reads, "Life's a witch, and then you fly. It just about says it all, doesn't it? You know, the whole sum of human knowledge and experience and 400 years of American history in Salem all boiled down to life's a witch, and then you fly. I was there in Salem because my mother was living in a senior residence in Beverly. She lived for many years in Rockport and always loved it, but she had Huntington's disease. And I would go up there sometimes and take her from the senior home and into the Huntington's clinic in Charlestown. Huntington's acts a lot like Alzheimer's, for those of you who don't know it, in that it's literally shrinking the brain. Eventually, your muscles shut down, and often you die when you can no longer breathe or from choking to death when your throat atrophies. Worst of all, it strips away your personality layer by layer, along with everything else. My mom never did accept that she had Huntington's. She always insisted that the test she'd been given had produced false positive, Mom? Yes, a false positive. It's not a false positive, Mom, if you can't think of the words false positive. Well, maybe then I'm the control, Mom? Yes, the control. And I would tell her, Mom, you can't be the control if you can't think of the word control. We did this a lot. And we would laugh about it because as much as she changed, as much as she forgot, she was always delighted to see me. And I was always glad to see her on our little trips into the clinic, although they made me more than a little nervous. You never knew what she might do or what might happen to her. She had only a very nominal idea by then of what stoplights meant anymore. On one occasion, she decided to strike up a conversation with a drug dealer in Boston Common. And she always liked to see how high she could lift her leg above the seats on the train. Higher than I could, I'm sure. We would go to the clinic where she would be examined and maybe given an MRI. They were simply studying her. There is no cure for Huntington's. And then I would take her out to get a lobster roll someplace, which is what she always wanted. And I would sit there terrified that she was going to choke to death on her food, which she had come close to doing on more than one occasion. You had to watch her very closely. Walking out in Charlestown after one appointment, I looked away for a moment, and she took a step and fell down in the street as if she'd been shot, even though she was still holding my arm. She bruised her arm and her leg, and she cut her forehead open, and I'm absolutely horrified. I'm the worst son in the world. But then she smiled at me and insisted she was fine. And when I was finally convinced that nothing was broken and that she didn't have a cerebral hemorrhage, we went to a restaurant where she was very happy to have her lobster roll, even while holding a napkin full of ice on the cut over her eye, while I sat watching her, more afraid than ever that she was going to choke to death in front of me. And afterwards, after I took her back to her senior home, I went and walked around the pedestrian mall in Salem with its statue of Elizabeth Montgomery and its answers to all your goth needs. And all I could think about was how much she had loved living in Rockport when we were growing up. Always loved just to look at it. She actually wrote, composed little songs for herself about it. She loved it so much. Before we made her give up her car keys because she'd become a danger on the road, she used to drive from the home in Beverly back to Dock Square just to look out over the harbor and the seagulls hovering above the lobster boats and the blue ocean. That's what always got me. The idea of her out there alone, sitting in her car by the dock, not understanding why she had been banished. My mother, you see, had lived her whole life with other people, with her family in one manifestation or another. And now she was sick, so she had to go live alone. Because, hey, life's a witch, and then you fly. And that night, sometime well after midnight, I was awakened when she called me at the hotel I was staying at because she thought I was coming to take her to dinner. Dearest, when are you coming to get me? Just that small, confused voice coming over the telephone line, speaking into all the indifference of the world. And I had to tell her that I was not coming. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin. That's wonderful. Our next storyteller is Pat Earle, a woman who has put hundreds of books into the hands of children in Gloucester. Pat, welcome.
Well, after that introduction and that last speech, I think I'll go home now. Thank you. It was lovely. First of all, I have a confession to make. My name is Pat, and I'm a compulsive reader. I will read anything, anywhere, at any time. Most days or times, I have 3 books going. I have one in the living room for my afternoon reading. I have one at my bedside, and I carry a book around with me in the car in case I have to wait somewhere and don't want to waste the time, so I read. Now, why did I become a compulsive reader? That is because of my father, Michael J. Caine. Now, I'm not here to tell his story tonight. If you invite me back, I might. It's a hell of a story. But my father is the one who introduced me to books and to reading, and this is why. My father was born towards the end of the 19th century. And at that time, he was living with his parents and his siblings on a small farm in Worcester. He was in school. He loved school. He wanted to be a teacher. When my father was 11, his father made a colossal mistake and allowed himself to be swindled out of the farm in return for what was supposed to be a hardware store in Worcester. They got to Worcester. There was no such address. There was no such place. There was nothing. And they had nothing except what they had brought with them. So at the age of 11, my father went to work in a factory. And this was in the dear dead days before child labor laws. So my father worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And he thought he would never get to be a teacher. But he went to the library on his day off, and he read, and he educated himself, and he taught himself more things probably than he could have learned in school. He never became a teacher, but he did become a very well-known and respected labor management relations consultant. President Roosevelt asked him to consult on the War Manpower Commission at the beginning of World War II, and Golda Meir invited him to Israel to help them get their business, industrial, and union combines going and organized. But my father always gave me books. I cannot remember a time when I couldn't read. It's like breathing. I could always read. My earliest childhood memory is that of my father's voice reading me Winnie the Pooh, Bar the Elephant, nursery rhymes, whatever. During the war, he traveled a lot and was gone. But once a month, a box would arrive for me at boarding school, and it was always a book, something he thought I might like. When I was 10, I got a huge box of what were called classic comics. I don't know if any of you remember them. This is in the when comics were anathema, children weren't supposed to read that, it'll ruin their little minds. But these were the great novels of the world in comic book form, and my father gave me the entire set. Well, my mother wasn't too thrilled, but she thought, well, my father talked her into it. And at the age of 10, I was reading Les Miserables, Gone with the Wind, not Gone with the Wind, my mother wouldn't let me read that at all. But to this day, thank you, Sidney Carton, I cannot watch somebody knit without shivering. As the war was over, we moved home. We had books everywhere. We had the world's largest unabridged dictionary. It had its own table. We had the Encyclopedia Britannica. Whenever I'd ask my father a question, he'd say, go look it up, and then come back and tell me what you found out. So that went on. When I graduated from college, I got a small sports car as a graduation present. I got an owner's manual, and my father also rode away to England for the mechanic's manual so I could maintain it. Well, the internal combustion engine was a little easier then in the early 60s to maintain. I went through life loving books and having fun and whatever. I got married. I went to New York. Here I am, a brand new bride. I had 2 cooking skills. I could boil water and make toast. I had this husband to feed. What was I going to do? Well, Julia Child and Jim Beard taught me how to cook. I'm going to be a parent. Uh-oh. Well, Dr. Spock, he's the one without the pointy ears, taught me that parenting wasn't so awful. And all the things I have learned from books. The only thing I never managed to teach myself from books was how to speak Japanese. I tried. God knows I tried. But thanks to Mike, I have all these heroes. Robin Hood, Mary Poppins, Katniss Everdeen, Horatio Hornblower, you name it. all because of my father, and all because he gave me this desire to read and to continue to read. I have this desire, and when I sit in a classroom, as I do, my small program, we take people like you. By the way, if any of you want to volunteer, I'll get you later. We go into the classroom once a month. We read a brand new children's book to the kindergarten and first grades, all the classes on Cape Ann. When we're finished reading, we give the book to the class because the elementary school libraries have been closed for over 10 years. And every once in a while I'll be reading and I'll catch a kid. I'll see a glint in their eye. I'll think to myself, oh, have I found another compulsive reader? Or am I really lucky and have I found another Mike Caine? Thank you.
Now, tomorrow, everyone's going to the library, right? Thank you, Pat.
My pleasure.
Our next storyteller is a very special guest from New York, Jack Hitt. Jack has appeared on The Moth several times, as well as This American Life, and it does give me great pleasure to introduce Jack. Thank you for being here tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. So, when my girlfriend Lisa, who would later become my wife, got into graduate school, we moved into a farmhouse outside of New Haven, Connecticut. And one night she told me she was going to go on one of these study jags, you know, just 5 hours in the books. So I built a fire. It was a night like this one. I snapped open my New York Times, and there was one of those recipes, you know? It said, curried red snapper chowder. Oh, yeah. Every word sounded delicious. Curried red snapper chowder. And you know, the writer really got his hooks into me right away. The opening paragraph, he told me that chowder comes from the French word chaudière, for the Breton pot that fishermen would bring aboard the ship when they were, you know, fishing cod, right? And it went on to say that chowder, the writer said, was not just a state of mind, but a state of heart. There was passion in this meal. The writer went on to say that chowder was a brace to the whistling dark winds of winter and the quiet nights of the soul. My God, this was a meal only readers of Herman Melville could understand. It was going to be an existential howl in every bowl. The writer went on to say that chowder was a balm to the great desire to cuddle and comfort. This wasn't just dinner. This was a French movie. It would begin with artisanal broths and spiced carrots and wind up somewhere on the second floor in a pile of quilts. So I went out and went shopping. I got this fresh fish and all these great vegetables from the local store. And Lisa came home. And she looked down at the recipe and she goes, well, this is rather heroic what you're doing here. It violates my home ec rule. Never cook anything whose list of ingredients is longer than one column. Woman, please, I explained in the language of my right eyebrow. I was a man in the kitchen, a man looking for love, but confident of a good meal. Now, you have to understand, this is the Middle Ages. There was no cable television or Food Network. The internet was very primitive at this time. And in these were the days when a man like myself would say things like, I love to cook. And it had about the same relationship to actual meaning that, say, I hate television, something I also said. Or, I love Citizen Kane. I'd never really seen Citizen Kane. And I watched a lot of episodes of Friends while eating Cheetos. But I realized once I started out, that I was no longer in the pretend world of scrambled eggs and toast. No. I was in a new world of hurt and pain that could come from 4 simple words like puree until liquefied, period, strain. And yet somehow my 5 or 10 pounds of carrots pressed so hard only gave me about 4 or 5 little red droplets in my chaudière. And then there was the note that said, fry celery leaves until crisp. I'm not even sure that tracked as a sentence. It's like boil until medium rare. And that's when I first realized that, recipes are not really written in English. It's this kind of freak hieroglyphics, right? It's somewhere between a riddle and haiku. I mean, there's so much experience that pour into those little words. And if you don't have the experience, like I said, you're in a world of pain and suffering. But I was not going to be defeated, so I heated up the pan and I cut off the celery leaves, and I threw them in there, and they just turned into these little chlorophyllic threads, like something that would come out of your button here, And I thought, okay, I'm not going to be defeated. I must have not, I got it. I was supposed to put them in there really flat. I mean, why didn't they say that in the recipe? It's so obvious, right? So I get in the car, drive back to the grocery store, get 2 bunches of celery stalks, cut the leaves off, heat up the pan. I lay them in there very flat, little threads. Good. Okay, I must not have turned up the heat enough, right? So I jump in the car, go back to the grocery store. Now they think I'm insane, right? I've bought out the entire celery counter. All right, I come home, cut up the leaves, I heat up the stove, it's smoking hot oil, put the celery leaves in there. They wilt again, little threads. I was like, all right. Did Breton fishermen really eat crispy celery leaves on their chowder? I don't think so. Moving on. So the next instruction told me to slice my carrots with a channel knife. A channel knife. Is that a trick for it? Is that like some fancy cook thing that just means a knife? Or is that something? And there was no internet for me to go to, so, and the way you dealt with your ignorance, at least I did back in the day before the internet, was I would just kind of like race out in front of it to something else, okay? And so I read on down and it said, chop up your celery root. And I looked at the bottom of my celery and there was no root. And I began to get this sort of warm feeling over my body that I didn't know really what I was doing. Maybe celery root was something, I don't know, it was all very vague. And at that point, I remember I stepped back and I accidentally swatted the bowl of some hour-long spicy carrot broth. My marriage counselor suggested I never discuss the spicy carrot broth again. I won't go into the detail except to say it took hours to create, and I swatted it onto the floor in an explosion of, porcelain. And I remember standing there and looking at the counter, like every bowl in my house was somehow on this counter. Everything was used and every spoon was out and everything was damp and wet and there were carrot peels everywhere and potato peels and I was soaking wet somehow. It really was a Herman Melville novel. Yeah, the ending of a Herman Melville novel. And I was just standing there lost in thought looking at this forest of denuded celery stalks filling up my windowsill. And I'm thinking, is there a recipe that calls for 10 bunches of celery? And then it's like 11 o'clock at night now, And Lisa comes down from her study jag and just sticks her head in the door. It's like, honey, is there an ETA on dinner? And I wheeled around And I explained to her, fuck you! This is all your fault! Chowder is stupid! You don't even have a channel knife in this kitchen. I can't cook chowder without a channel knife! Or words to that effect. It was about 4,000 words long, that speech, but I've edited out all the obscenities, so that's all you got. That's all that's left, you know. And, you know, we finally did sit down to the chowder at around midnight, you know. It wasn't so bad, you know. Lisa said, actually, it was even maybe pretty good, you know, but I'm told by them that know that when you have 12 hours of hunger behind you, the same can be said for old gum. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. That was quite a special treat. Our next storyteller is Maggie Rosa, fondly known as the woman who saved City Hall.
I feel like I'm at a fireworks display and or a symphony where everything builds up to a crescendo and there's the boost of fireworks at the end and everybody goes away happy. And now I'm left to pick up the pieces. I can't top you. I won't even try. So my little story, and I'm not certainly a professional story, starts in 1891. And the reason I have chosen my heroine is because she has an impact on Gloucester, she has a business, an impact on the world, on business, finance, arts. And so I'll go back to 1891, when a gentleman by the name of Charles William Post suffers a nervous breakdown, and he moves from Springfield, Illinois, with his wife and daughter Marjorie to Battle Creek, Michigan. Nobody has ever heard of Battle Creek, Michigan, or few had at that time. And he is treated by a physician by the name of Dr. John Kellogg. Kellogg wasn't a well-known name at that time either. Some of you are rapidly putting Kellogg and Battle Creek together and coming up with the name of the heroine, who is, lo and behold, Marjorie Merriweather Post. So Charles William Post, or better known as C.W. Post, has suffered this nervous breakdown, but he had a history of being an inventor and a businessman. And he sees that the holistic approach of Dr. John Kellogg works for some people, didn't work very well for him, but he notices that there's a diet that consists mostly of vegetables and non-caffeinated products. And maybe a little sleazy, but, you know, things get smoothed over with the passage of time. C.W. Post invents his own, or develops his own, non-caffeinated drink, which he names Postum. So he then has to have a market for this drink, this non-caffeinated drink. And in those days, women went to the grocery store with a list and they knew exactly what they wanted. However, advertising was an emerging field, and C.W. Post says, okay, if I want to sell my product, I'm going to have to use some advertising. And I'm going to have to make those women want my product, and they'll go to the grocery store and they will find my Postum on the shelves. And indeed, that's what happened. The business took off. C.W. Post is continuing to mess around, and the next thing he develops and markets are grape nuts. So everybody's eating grape nuts still these days. And then there's a little aside for the story, but the physician John Kellogg has a brother who also named Kellogg, surprisingly enough, and he says, okay, there's a business to be made here. So then the Kellogg's cereals business starts taking place in Battle Creek, and to this day, Battle Creek remains the place where cereals are made. But you may be wondering, well, where the hell is the heroine in my story? So Marjorie was the only child of C.W. Post and his wife Ella. And knowing that they couldn't have more children, C.W. starts to train his daughter to become a business person. And he takes her on business trips, takes her to business meetings, quizzes her, makes sure that she knows accounting, etc., etc. So Marjorie grows up with a very strong business acumen. And this is all about the age, starting at the age of 10. Father also teaches her that she should have some skills and physical skills. So he teaches her to box. And she puts this talent to use when some guys are trying to be smart-assed to her. And I think I'm using my language because Jim Dowd and Katie are here. See, these guys approach her and tease her, and she all of a sudden lands them one. And she never got treated again by these guys, teased by these guys. So she goes to the East Coast, and she marries, the first marriage of ultimately 4 marriages, a man who is described as very bland. So why she's picked him, who knows? But anyway, they have a marriage, they have 2 children, then sadly, C.W. Post has another nervous breakdown and commits suicide. So at the age of 27, Marjorie, mother had died a couple of years earlier. She's left in charge of this company, which is now called Postum Foods. And it's also the time of the First World War, so women are becoming more independent and having more responsibilities when the men are off fighting, including the bland husband. Bland husband, the war ends, bland husband comes back, Marjorie realizes he's very bland, she gets rid of him, and within a year she marries E.F. Hutton. Remember those advertisements? Now, E.F. Hutton is a self-made, very successful financier. And so Marjorie sees a lot of herself in him, and also of her father. And so they get married. She is suspecting that her father's old-time board directors are not really doing what she wants them to do. So she puts E.F. Hutton in charge. And with another gentleman, they expand Postum Foods, and they take over lots of small companies, names that you would recognize like Jell-O, and Hellmann's Mayonnaise and all these other little companies, and hugely expand General Foods. Expand Postum Foods. I'm getting ahead of myself. But E.F. and Marjorie like the good life. E.F. has had a tradition of having very large yachts, and Marjorie likes this lifestyle. And they have the boats are generally called Hussar, 1, 2, 3, get to 4, and it's a 200-foot long, 3-masted something or other that comes up and comes into Gloucester quite frequently because they're friends with the John Hayes Hammond family. Now the story gets a little murky, and those of you who are going to say it's all about a goose are quite right, because that's the best story of Marjorie. It is the goose story. And the goose story appeared in the New York Times obituary of Marjorie, so don't argue with me. If it's in the news, New York Times, it's all the fit to print, right? So you get it. So Marjorie comes into town and demands goose for dinner. It's not goose season. Chef goes off downtown, and he is introduced to Clarence Birdseye, who has, as you all know, recently arrived in Gloucester a couple of years before this boat trip, and he's busy freezing everything and trying to develop the frozen foods business. So the chef takes the goose, thaws it, cooks it, and Marjorie is amazed. And Marjorie, being the smart businesswoman that she is, recognizes the potential for making lives of women easier. But E.F. Hutton says, no, doesn't matter. So Marjorie wanted to buy Birdseye out at that time. 3 years pass by, and Clarence is accumulating a large amount of frozen fish. He's got 1.6 million pounds of frozen fish somewhere in Gloucester that he can't market. And so one of his business, and so they're running out of money. And so one of his business partners says, well, we should go and approach other financial companies to back us, because we're never going to get the frozen fish business off the ground if we don't have a lot of good financial backing. It's too big for us, okay? So somewhere along the line, and again the details are murky, but there is an offer made by E.F. Hutton and his people to Birdseye and his people. What do you want for your frozen foods? And Birdseye was 10 million for 75%. I go back and they say, no, the Poston people say, no, we don't want 75% of the business. We want 100% of the business. What are you going to give? What do you want for 100% of the business? E.F. Hutton, with his connections with Goldman Sachs, gets together, and they ultimately settle on $22 million for the purchase of the Birdseye business, and also negotiated that Birdseye is going to stay in leading the research group. So there was a congressional investigation of this deal because a lot of people lost a lot of money. However, Marjorie has won the day. She's gotten the Birdseye frozen foods business. Takes the next story that I'll never ask back will be maybe a continuation of how the frozen foods business developed, because remember this, there was no refrigerated transportation, or very poor refrigerated transportation. Stores didn't have freezers. Houses didn't have refrigerators, so that all of that industry needed to be developed. But Marjorie had won the day, and E.F. Hutton, with his big ego, doesn't really like that. So that marriage is out the window. Marjorie, within another year, becomes the first woman of a board. So she's really assuming a lot of power, more power in this. Post's company becomes General Foods Company. Marjorie marries another guy who's a diplomat, goes to Russia, and I'm just going to finish it, amasses a huge art collection. And when she's back from Russia, he fails, so she's out. There was a fourth husband, and he didn't survive very long. But Marjorie is the epitome of Americana, women's independence, financial chutzpah.
Farther out is Norman's Woe, half hidden in the tide, it has claimed many vessels. It was where Longfellow lay down the Hesperus. Behind me, Joe Hot Dog is setting up for the day. He is docking his pickup and its restaurant trailer with the curb, readying for the tourists and the mug-up crowd from the fish plants around the corner. The trailer is new then. He used to have just a pushcart. Joe Hot Dog, a sign on the trailer says proudly, since 1973. No restrooms. Joe's real last name is Wahedowitz, but the locals found that totally unpronounceable, so he quickly became Joe Hot Dog, and Joe Hot Dog he has remained. To the left is the fort, the home of the fish plants and the people who work them. Narrow, crooked streets and sagging processing plants that cast dark shadows even on a bright day like today. The white tower of the O'Donnell-Houston plant stands peeling in the sun behind Pavilion Beach. It's been closed for 2 years. 200 jobs gone. A plaque on the wall notes that it's the place where Clarence Birdseye invented frozen food. Beyond the fort is the inner harbor where the fishing boats tie up. It's a nice day, but windy, so the small boats are hunkered down at the pier, waiting for more advantageous conditions. The larger boats have larger payrolls and larger mortgages. I watched the Joseph and Lucia make its way to sea, setting out on the long overnight trip to George's. The crew makes the deck gear secure and then settles on the forecastle to warm in the sun. Captain Johnny comes walking down the boulevard to where I stand. Johnny must be close on to 80 now, but he still leads the group of men who carry the statue of St. Peter at Fiesta. He's getting back into shape for this year's procession. He's in good shape for his age. He and his wife go to the dances upstairs at the St. Peter's Club, where he twirls her around, dipping and swaying to the big band sounds. He sees me, and I nod. Usually that's the extent of our interaction. But today, Captain Johnny pauses. Maybe he needs a break. Maybe he just wants to talk. He stands beside me, and we look out over the harbor together. He still has a full shock of white hair, long and today blowing out behind him in the breeze. His face is tanned already, and though lined, it doesn't sag. He is carved of Cape Ann granite. I call him Captain Johnny, but in truth, the only thing he ever commanded was a one-man lobster boat called the Babe. It's the Babe he wants to talk about today. He sold Babe 10 years ago when he retired. They had fished together 45 years, he told me. He bought it for $200 in 1932 from the widow of another lobsterman who had disappeared one day, snagged by a pot line and pulled over, so it was assumed. The widow would have sold the Babe for $100, but Johnny knew it was worth more than that, so he paid the extra, even though it was the deepest part of the Depression. In 1938, he remembered President Roosevelt had called in Gloucester on his yacht coming back from Campobello. The Babe had led a small flotilla out to greet the vessel, flags flying, horns and whistles blaring. Roosevelt had come up on the deck and waved to them, Johnny remembered. Waving at me, he said, waving at the Babe. He paused a moment, reflecting, remembering. I sold her to a fella in Camden, he said, lobsterman like me. I hope he took good care of her. We stand there a moment longer, looking out at the western harbor past the breakwater at the Dog Bar, out to sea. Then he raises his head and takes his hands from the rail. He nodded one more time. He threw back his still broad shoulders and walked on, out of time and into the wind. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. It leaves such a nice picture in my mind. Our next storyteller is Danuka Borchardt. Did I say that right? Borchardt. I knew I wasn't going to get it right. I always get names wrong. But Danuka, thank you for coming to tell a story at Fish Tales. Danuka is a retired Harvard professor and an author.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a little lower. Thank you. It's hard to rise to the occasion both in height and in tone, so I'll do my best and go back to sea. My father was a served in the Polish merchant navy before the war. And at the outbreak of World War II in 1939, he was in a ship off the British coast somewhere. At the time, the British Navy took over the Polish merchant ships, which then served as supply ships and troop ships. So he was assigned with a captain whom he knew from the past. He himself was his first officer then. So they were assigned to transatlantic passenger liner to serve, to transport some troops. This was in close to Newcastle on Tyne. On November 25, 1939, they were given a let go, clear exit from Newcastle. My father suddenly woke up during the night with a thump and another thump. He realized that something went terribly wrong. So he quickly dressed and tried to get out of the cabin, but he couldn't because the ceiling had jammed the door. So, he decided that's not the way he's going to die. He was a very tall man, a very strong man, so he lifted the ceiling just enough to squeeze by and get out. So he rushed then to get all the men into the lifeboats and was looking for the captain, who they couldn't find where the captain was. Finally, they saw him and wanted to get him to the lifeboat, also the last lifeboat, but he wouldn't go because he heard some young guys screaming for help somewhere. So the captain went to get those guys. They cast the a raft off the boat and swam to the boat in to the raft, swam in the frigid water. In the meantime, my father was getting the last people into the last lifeboat, and a boom hit him in the head, and he lost consciousness. However, they got him onto the lifeboat, and eventually he woke up in the hospital and learned that the guys with the captain were all right, but the captain died presumably of hypothermia. My father then was, after a few months, of recovery, he was on another ship off the coast of Norway. And by some mistake, they were getting bombed, but the British ship, Wolverine, I think it was called, was trying to rescue the men. However, the hero, this is a sideline to another hero, knew how the ship was constructed. This was, again, a Polish liner, passenger liner. He knew how it was constructed. So somehow, in all this havoc and turmoil of being bombed, he managed to keep the ship in such a way that the ammunition was as far from the bombing of where the bombs were hitting. And this way, more men could be saved. So that's what happened. After the war, my father returned to Poland. He became before the war he was educating cadets on the tall ship Dar Pomorza, which, by the way, came here to Boston in 1976 in celebration of the anniversary. But my father was not on it. He was in Poland at the time because the communist regime would not let him be on ships anymore. And this was, the guys on the tall ship were very proud because they were the only ones that sailed into the Boston harbor under sail, not on hold. So Well, anyway, when my father went back to Poland, he continued to be an educator of cadets and also wrote books. He decided to, actually, he went to the grave of the captain who was buried in England, and he swore that someday he will write a book about him. And so he wrote a book about maritime stories, stories of the sea, and dedicated this book to Captain Stankiewicz. And now I'm translating this book into English. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Danuka. Our next storyteller is Russell Sherman, and please come on up and tell your story, Russ.
Hi, everybody. This story took place in 1972. It is a true story. I got out of school in 71 and came up this way for a summer job, owing student loans and everything. Another buddy of mine graduated with me, went fishing. And we ended up in the fall of 1972 in our first offshore site, which was offshore lobstering. At the time, the offshore lobster trap industry was just beginning, and it was prosecuted out in the canyons. Pardon me, we were a couple of green kids, hair down to here. My buddy Glenn had a big red beard, and we fell in with a bunch of maniacs. And all we had to recommend ourselves was reasonable intelligence and a willing to work. Both of us had been brought up in rather plebeian families and worked hard. So we spent our first season learning. At the end of the first season, our captain, who was a fellow from Maine, we nicknamed him Captain Smoke Tread Lightning, because he was a driven man, a workaholic. And he had been a small boat fisherman in Maine for many years, quite a reputation up that way. Well, the poor guy, I won't say the poor guy, how should I say that? He drove himself to a nervous breakdown one trip. When we refused to go on deck, because my buddy, Glenn, actually had the oil jacket sleeve torn off of his arm and would have gone with it if the wire hadn't just slipped his hand. And so the cook, who is my hero, I'm here because of him today, a fellow named Robert Damon. He used to say, Mrs. Damon's little boy Robert, was how he introduced ourselves to us. Flat top brush cut, beard, didn't have much use for long-haired boys. But he appreciated work and respect, and we respected him. We did exactly what he said. He spoke up that morning when the skipper said, "Boys, I hate laying to. Do you want to go to work?" And he said, "David, if someone goes out there, if we go back on that deck this morning, we're going to lose somebody, and I won't stand for it." The engineer, Steve, I'll leave his name at Steve, was a Greek fellow, handsome, 6'2", 190 pounds, the epitome of a Greek sailor. And he had been a missile man on the Nautilus and was quite proud of it, and we were quite impressed. Always wore a Greek captain's cap, trim beard, well-dressed. Didn't talk much, but a good shipmate, a really great shipmate. Well, when we were all fired, he drove the boat home in a gale of northwest wind. We come 24 hours from Lydonia Canyon, bucking into it. He tied the throttle down and he stuck his knife in the dashboard next to it and said, "Don't let any of you son of a bitches cut that string." And we didn't. So we all, when we got to the dock, we were all packing our gear. The captain jumped ashore. The owners of the boat, which was the Usen brothers, came back and they said, "Where are you going, boys?" So we said, "Well, we're packing our clothes. We've been fired. We've been put ashore." And he said, "David's had a problem, and we're taking care of that. Why don't you all stay?" And so what happened was, of course, they were anxious to get the boat back out because we'd gone all the way to the canyons, started to haul gear. We had one string aboard. Of course, it was catastrophe. We came back home again, and being a company boat, they were worried about money. So they promoted Stevie to captain, which he was more than qualified for. Bob Damon, who Bob was an old man to me. I was 24, he was 48 or 49, old enough to be my father. He remained as the mate and the cook. And Glenn was promoted to engineer. And we reported right back to Boston the next day, ready to go fishing. The replacement came aboard, a little short Newfoundlander, about that tall, 3 fingers missing on his left hand, and quite a cocky little guy. And in putting his bag and everything into the bunk, took a .32 gun out of his pocket and made everybody see it, tucked it under his pillow, you know. And we were impressed, both being just kids ourselves, you know. And he sat down and proceeded to tell us the story about how he had been drinking one night down at the State Fish Pier in Boston, and had run out of smokes. No place open, so he broke into the No Name restaurant, famous restaurant down there, smashed in the cigarette machine, got his 2 decks of Camels, and walked out into the cold to be confronted by a state officer. Of course, the state troopers run that place. And he was so brilliant that he ran off and tried to make an escape, jumped into the water, and they had to save him. So anyway, the scene is set, and we're steaming back out into the grounds. Well, there was gale warnings had been put up before we left the dock. And Stevie really didn't want to go, but, you know, they were pushing us. And so we started out. And as we proceeded, it was a long steam, storm warnings were posted. And we were down in the forecastle talking, of course, and it was a bad custom, but we never had problems with it before. We always had a few cases of beer on the boat. Schlitz, as it would be. And the Newfoundlander made this discovery and was all giggles and started lugging beer up to the skipper. Well, we didn't realize it. Stevie was a fine gentleman and everything and a smart guy, but he had an alcohol problem that none of us knew about because, of course, we didn't socialize ashore. And so the day went by, and the fleet had turned around and was heading for Nantucket because of storm warnings that had been posted. Steve called the company and said that he wanted to turn the boat around and go for Nantucket as well. The company said, don't bring that boat to the dock. And in those days, it was WOU, was the telephone communication. You call the shoreside operator, ship-to-shore operator, over your 2-way radio. They connected you, and you talked over and out, back and forth on a telephone conversation. But the whole ocean could hear you. All the fellas were tuned into WOU. Believe me, we heard some great conversations in the evening sometimes as young fellas listening to the guys pining away for their wives. But an argument ensued, of course. Some of the other skippers came in and said, let them come out here and let her lay, you know, let them take the beating, you know, they're sitting in an office and all this stuff. And so, of course, the beers were going down. We weren't drinking. We were down reading. I love to read as well. Bring a book with me wherever I go. And it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The boys up above, the Newfoundlander and the skipper, were not eating at all, which should have clued me in, but I was green in those days and didn't realize what the demon run could do to people, although I'd had a few experiences myself. Just had a beautiful dinner. I remember it was a boiled dinner. Bob was a great cook, a great Yankee cook. And we're all sitting around the table. Now, actually, I was in the bunk, and Glenn was in the bunk. Bob was at the edge of the table. We were having our after-dinner smoke. And the boat slid, caught and slid. Now, that's a funny thing, you know, because the boat's not supposed to stop. And it did. And we didn't know. Bob turned white. He was a big man, 5'11", 220. And she let go. And she slid again, and she let go, and she slid the third time, and she stopped. And Bob started to get up, and we said, Bob, what's going on? He said, I think we're aground. And sure enough, we were. What had happened was we were coming up to Nantucket on the eastern side, and he went up one buoy shy and headed her to the western. and he went right up on a sandbar that was about 600 yards to the south of the Rosencrown Shoal, where some years before a fishing boat had lost all hands in that area, precisely the same problem. It was just before dark, and the easterly wind was breezing up pretty heavy. The boat started lifting and pounding. Of course, we were right, Bob started up the stairs. We were way down on the forecastle, came to the middeck, and then up to the higher deck where the captain and the Newfoundlander were. We came right up the stairs behind him, Glenn and I, a couple of boys thinking that perhaps we'd chosen the wrong occupation. She was pounding quite hard. It was hard to get up. You know, there was a lot of, the scene that greeted us when we got up in the pilot house was everything around us was turquoise blue. We were on Sand Shoal, and it was blowing about 20, 25 easterly now, starting to pick up, and everything was turquoise blue, and the waves started to break over her on the side. The wheel was spinning, was a destroyer wheel, no spokes onto her, outside spokes. The wheel was spinning, and it was a hydraulic rig. We had a little pin here with a little rubber Mexican guy on the pin. When you pulled the pin up, it stopped the wheel dead. Well, the skipper, who was in his cups, well into his cups, was trying to stop the wheel, because actually the only thing that was exposed was the rudder and the wheel. We were that far into the sandbar. And to forget, we'd gone over 2 sandbars to get to the third. Stevie was quite comical in doing it. Bob was not impressed. Now, Bob had been fishing all his life. He was a guy in his late 40s. Went over, turned him around with his left hand and gave him the sweetest right hook I've ever seen, and collapsed him right on the spot. He collapsed, he just, boom. The skipper was down and out. The Newfoundlander, the great boy with the .32 pistol, was in the corner, tears in his eyes, praying, "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with us." And Bob looked around, he told Ingvi right away, very calm, very collected, "Go down to the engine room." The engine room was aft. "Make sure the water's all right. Make sure she's not leaking. Give me a report. Sherman, I want you to go down to the fish hole. Do the same. Get going now. Come on, boys, let's go." We obeyed immediately, as we were green college boys. That's all we were, and from Connecticut besides. The farm boys. Bob immediately got on the radio, Mayday to the Coast Guard in Nantucket. We had the old Loran A's in those days, and it was quite an ordeal. It was quite a sequence of events to get your positioning in on there. He did that, found out where he was. Now it became dark. As I said, she was always lifting herself and pounding. I didn't know how much longer she would take, how much longer she could stand it, and neither did Bob. There was a Portuguese boat behind us, an old Eastern rig dragger, that had come up, and of course he had witnessed this, and he was on the radio as well. He called us, and he said, "Captain," he said, "I can't come in to get you." He said, "There's no way out of there except the way you came, and I can't risk my vessel and my crew to help you out. But if somehow, on God's good earth, if you can turn that boat around, I will stand on station, and you come for my masthead light. It's the fastest, it's the only way out of there. If you can get her to turn around, you come for me." And that's exactly what that man did. He got that V16 Jimmy, and he beat the living hell out of her. And we were lucky. The storm was increasing, the waves were getting larger, but the tide was coming. And every time she'd lift, he'd give it to her. He'd jam her hard, and he brought her. And he brought her around 180 degrees, so she was pointing out. And he took us out of there. He took us out of there, and we got in behind the Portuguese fella, and into Nantucket we came. Now it's blowing about 40, 45, and it's driving rain, raindrops that long. And I'll never forget, as long as I live, we were all, of course, huddled in the wheelhouse at the time. Glenn and I were, it was like being in a bad movie. I mean, we really didn't, everything was slowing down. It was really Fellini-esque. I mean, kind of realized, what the hell are we doing here? We were in college 18 months ago, you know. This is the real world now. And wow. And I'll never forget, we pulled into the dock, and Bob had the wheel. And Stevie was very sheepish. He had sobered up, and he had quite a bruise on the side of his face. But you know, he never got out of the sitting position that whole time. He sat in that corner like a little boy. And Bob got to the dock, and he said, "Now, Skipper," he said, "put your vessel to the wharf." And he walked out, and he took his accustomed bow line, and we came ashore. The Portuguese fellow tied up alongside of us, and of course we all went over to thank him heartily. And it was, I remember the forecastle was beautiful. It was in all dark wood, and it was kept beautifully. It shined. And we had coffee and we had cookies. And the Coast Guard came and questioned us at the time. And one of the young Coast Guard fellows led on to Glenn and I, because we were compatriots of the same age. He said, "We never could have gotten you fellows. We ran aground coming outside the harbor, and we never could have gotten to you anyway," which was quite revealing. And I remember complimenting the cook on his forecastle, and I said, how beautiful you keep this living quarters. And he said, "Well, you know," and I said, "Yeah, there's no reason to live like a pig." And when I said that, he said, "Oh, don't ever say that word." He said, "Capitone catches you say that word, he'll throw you off the boat." And that was the first time I came to the realization or the knowledge that pig was a terrible word that you never say on a fishing boat. And in later years, perhaps another story, it came to pass. So we went out and we had a few drinks, to say the least. And Bob, being older, went his way. Glenn and I went our way. And later on that evening, on the Lucky Me, which was a boat out of Gloucester, it was an old Boston beam trawler, and everything in a Boston beam trawler was in the stern, the galley and everything. And it was a beautiful old boat with the round portholes. And we were all young fellows at the time in our 20s. And all of a sudden, this big moon face appeared in the porthole, you know. And it was Bob. And he said, "Boys got a Budweiser for an old Downeaster?" You know, and, "Oh, come in. And we'd been telling the fellows about this guy whom Glenn and I had nicknamed earlier the Iron Man. And he was the Iron Man. He did things one time, while Glenn and I were arguing about going up high aloft and tying off a vang on a boom, the two of us being the youngest. That was a job for a young man. Bob was already up there doing it. And Glenn and I were, "You go. No, you go." You know. And so we came in and we had a few drinks, and then I remember Bob grabbed me under one arm, and he got Glenn under the other. And we were in our cups. And he said, "You know, I never had much use for you long-haired bastards," he says, "but you two are all right," he said. And we had made the grade at that point. And Bob wanted to fly home right away, but the company begged him to stay and bring the boat home. And I know they bribed him with a substantial check. And a plane ticket home to, well, Bar Harbor, Maine, Northeast Harbor, actually. And so to end up the story, 1982, I was just married. I was deckhand on the Tremont, which was the high-line boat out of the East Coast. And we'd come into the auction early in the morning. There were 2 phone booths there. There was no cell phones and stuff, of course. And everybody, all the married fellows, and I was just recently married, would get in line and wait to call your wife to tell her that you were home alive and safe. And there's a fella over in the corner ahead of me, you know, and tack-turn-looking fella with a Greek captain's cap on. And I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me, and he sidled up to me, and he said, "This is Sherman." He says, "Is that you?" I said, "Yeah, Stevie, that's you, isn't it?" He said, "Yes, it is." He said, "And I want you to know that I never touched a drop since that very day." That was it.
Thank you, Russell. We have just one more story, and I would call it an encore. Jack Hitt and Kevin Baker come back up.
Okay. To kind of compromising the microphone here. All right.
All right, so in case you haven't noticed, there is a sub-theme tonight of food. Frozen fish, hot dogs, God knows, chowder.
Chowder.
And so I think we all know that, this is a nation of eaters, right? And I don't know if you've noticed, but menus these days have become a kind of almost a literary genre unto themselves. And I noticed this the other day. I saw this item on the internet. Someone was parodying the great hipster menus, and they had these appetizers on it. One was oysters from a charming New England enclave, $3 per.
Such as this
Yeah, oysters from an obscure northwestern town. Another appetizer, 8 olives in a ramekin. An entree of gnarly-looking whole fish with half a charred lemon. And my favorite, pork chop from a wise, soulful farmer. So Kevin and I have stumbled on some of this literature, and so this is a little item that we call
actual meals. This is dueling menus.
Dueling menus.
Actual meals from actual restaurants in places like New York. And if you can eat any of the items we have here, you are truly heroic. You are a true hero or heroine of the night here.
Okay. Orangina smoked salmon terrine in crisp omelet, a dish referred to on Yelp as a love child of a country club buffet and a 70s airline dessert.
Let's not forget the exquisite Asian cuisine you can get in New York, Jack, such as at the Empire Szechuan 98, where you can lead off with Mom's special pork feet soup.
Oh yeah? Salmon and tomato juice gratin.
Well, then you go right on to your black fungus with mixed pepper.
Crunchy peanut butter and celery sandwich.
That crunchy peanut butter. I'm lost here on this. Oh yes, this is a specialty of the house: intestines and duck blood with pickled cabbage in chili sauce.
Oh really? 2 words, Baker. Anchovy popcorn.
3 words: stewed pork ball.
Oh yeah? Wafer thin ham, mayonnaise, and pineapple.
Well, how about chicken nugget and jellyfish with fresh pepper? It's the fresh pepper that really makes it.
Cabbage with raisins and milk.
Don't forget hot and spicy pig intestine.
Blackberry and turnip pie.
Ox tongue and tripe with hot chili oil.
Okay, here's my favorite. Porridge with curried sardines.
And finally, we have sautéed pot frog with pork short rib and, wait for it, intestines.
Thank you.
Thanks again, guys. Our next Fish Tales is March 13th. That would be Friday, March 13th. And our theme is what else? Bad luck. It's Friday the 13th. Our location is to be announced, so please check the website of the Gloucester Writer Center. Thank you all for coming to Fish Tales. We hope to see you at the next show.